Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for the third virtual dialogue series for enabling resilience and scaling up action on climate change adaptation. Our session today is called Inclusive Economic Development Through Resilience, Opportunities for Doing More and Doing Differently. I'm Dory, and along with Em and Elizabeth, will be your technical facilitators today. Please use the Q&A function for your questions, where you can also upvote others' questions and comment on them. And please add your name and organization affiliation to your question so we may address you properly. The chat function is disabled for this webinar. I will now pass the floor to Preeti Bandari, the Chief of Climate Change and Disaster Risk Management Theme at Asian Development Bank and Director of Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department at ADB. Preeti, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And let me welcome all the participants to this webinar. And this webinar is part of a curtain raiser for the 7th Asia Pacific Adaptation Network Forum. And there are several other events that are taking place as part of this curtain raiser. And as you heard, the topic today is about economic sector resilience, what we can do more and what we can do differently to build economic resilience. We have a lineup of experts and stars for you, and we hope to engage in a fruitful discussion in this particular 90 minutes that have been set out. Just to let you know, this curtain raiser will lead to the 7th Asia Pacific Adaptation Network Forum, which is being hosted by the government of Japan in March 2021. And as I said earlier, there are 4 streams which will be discussed at this particular forum, and economic resilience is one of the 4 themes. And the purpose of the discussion today is to engage with you, the experts and the stakeholders, to chart out what are the important opportunities for building economic resilience. And the discussion today would inform the designing of this particular stream at the final forum in March 2021. And this discussion is also relevant in the context of the Global Conference on Adaptation that will take place next year, and also the UN Climate Conference later in December 2021, the COP26 as it is called. So it is a very, very important event in the run-up to the major events that will be taking place in 2021. And it is my unique honor and privilege to introduce the chair of the session today, which is Mr. Carlos Dominguez, the Secretary of the Department of Finance in the government of the Philippines. He took time out to provide opening remarks through a pre-recorded video. And his Assistant Secretary, Ms. Paula Alvarez, has also joined us for this particular event and will be engaging during the discussion session. So if I could request the technical team to launch the opening remarks by the chair of this meeting. Thank you.
Dr. Yasuyuki Sawada, Chief Economist of the Asian Development Bank. Distinguished guests, good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity for the Philippines to chair this important webinar. I am pleased to discuss our country's experience in pursuing inclusive economic development through resilience. The Philippines is an archipelago of more than 7,000 islands. It sits right on the typhoon belt, where an average of 20 tropical cyclones visit every year. It is located along the Pacific Ring of Fire, where volcanic activity and earthquakes occur frequently. Hence, the Philippines is ranked 9th out of 181 nations in the 2020 World Risk Index of most disaster-prone countries in the world. We are extremely vulnerable to rising sea levels extreme weather conditions, and other calamities associated with the warming of the Earth's climate. At the beginning of this year, we had to evacuate communities within reach of the Taal volcano eruption. Just this week, a typhoon struck parts of the main island of Luzon that flooded many areas. Like most countries, we are also in the midst of a great battle against COVID-19. The pandemic added to our vulnerabilities, but it has steeled our determination to make our economic development more inclusive and our communities more resilient. Because global warming threatens us even more severe weather conditions, the government has put together a national disaster risk reduction and management plan, the disaster risk financing and insurance strategy. Over time, and with much investment, we are trying to relocate communities at greatest risk. This will obviously be a labor of generations. We have also set up an agency focused on disaster risk reduction, organized down to the smallest political units. It will help localities prepare the logistics needed to save lives in the face of calamities. We developed a countrywide catastrophe risk model. We have put together a comprehensive inventory of government assets through the National Asset Registry System. The mechanism aims to create a consolidated report that will encourage good governance, accountability, and greater transparency, as well as prudent asset management. The ongoing pandemic has forced us to rethink our ways of economic life, which makes this an opportune moment to intensify our actions on the climate crisis. The Philippines is turning the contagion into an opportunity to begin building sustainable and safer cities. We aim to shift our investments to clean energy resources and green technologies. We are fortunate to have faced the COVID-19 crisis with strength on the food security front. The key components of our success in this area are the rice tariffication law and the Agriculture Department's effective management of our food supply. As part of our economic recovery strategy, we seek to hasten the modernization of Philippine agriculture to boost the sector's resilience against future emergencies. When the COVID-19 crisis hit, the Philippines was financially ready. In 2016, we had started building up our finances to support our aggressive infrastructure program to help Filipinos lift themselves from poverty. Little did we know that this financial buildup also buttressed our defenses against economic shocks. President Rodrigo Duterte's tax reforms and other game-changing measures passed over the last 4 years have strengthened our fiscal stamina. Our strong fiscal position gave us the headroom needed to reallocate budget items and quickly access emergency loans to fight the pandemic. Despite the many populist excuses to grow the deficit and bury future generations in debt, the Philippines has chosen the path of fiscal prudence. Our stimulus measures take into account that the pandemic has an unclear timeline. This is going to be a marathon, not a sprint. We want to have ample ammunition to outlast this enemy. COVID-19 will not be the last pandemic. We do not know what the next health crisis or disaster will be, but we know that it will come, and we must be prepared. The Philippines, therefore, is pursuing policies targeted towards bolstering our fiscal position to withstand future adversities. At the same time, we are pushing for more fiscal reforms that will shape our societies towards greater inclusiveness. Inclusive growth should not be an abstraction left for economies to figure out. It should be a way of life for the whole society. All of us must consciously strive to master uncertainties, work probabilities to our advantage, and open up opportunities to uncover our economic strengths. Inclusive growth should be a process of empowering individuals and communities so that the whole of society becomes more resilient, productive, and confident. Our progress needs to be understood in these terms. I look forward to learning from the experiences of other countries and the rich discussion that makes this meeting possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Dominguez, for those remarks and also for highlighting the forward-looking initiatives that Philippines has undertaken over the past years for economic development and also for building financial fiscal resilience, which has allowed for preparedness for not only the current crisis that we are in, but also highlighting the importance of preparedness for future risks and future crises. Um, Based on that high note that we have started with, we would also like to know a bit more about our participants. And for that, we are trying to engage with you through the Mentimeter. So if you could log on to menti.com and use the code 7167080, we will launch 3 poll questions to get to know you better, to get to know the context from which you're coming from. So if I could request the technical team to launch the poll, please. So in terms of participation, you can see we have a lot of participants from Southeast Asia. We also have participants from East and North Asia and South Asia, and are delighted to have some colleagues joining us from outside the Asia Pacific region as well. And of course, we have participants from the Pacific, which is at the front line insofar as climate impacts and vulnerability goes. So this is a very nice, diverse set of participation that we have at this event today. Could we go on to the poll question 2, please? Again, we see a diverse set of organizations that you're representing. We are glad to have participants from the governments in the region, from the academia, from civil society organizations who are also very, very essential to the response. And pleasantly surprised to see some participation from the private sector. And of course, we have a large cohort from multilateral organizations. And I'm sure this behooves well for the discussion we'll have moving forward. So let's go on to the third question, please. Okay, so we obviously are talking to the converted over here. Investment in climate resilience is critical for advancing sustainable economic development. We all believe in it, and that's why we are here for this event. And we have over 100 30 participants who have joined us today. Thank you for engaging with the Mentimeter and giving us a good insight into the variety and diversity of organizations you represent and the worldview that you come from. Let me now move on quickly to the second part of the opening session and introduce my colleague, the Chief Economist at the Asian Development Bank, Mr. Yasuki Sawada. Savada-san is very well known, not only within ADB, but also in the region and outside for his interest in development economics and also in microeconometrics. Amongst his various interests in research, he is also focusing on disaster and risk resilience and poverty dynamics, and the connection between those subjects and the topic of the seminar today is very, very evident. So let me, with those words, hand it over to you, Sawada-san, for your keynote to get us started with the next part of this meeting. Over to you, Sawada-san.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you very much, Preeti, for a very warm introduction. And also, I'd like to thank Secretary Dominguez for a very nice opening remarks. It's my great pleasure and great honor to speak today. I'd like to thank the organization of 7th Asia Pacific Climate Change Adaptation Forum for having me today for webinar on inclusive economic development through resilience. So today I'd like to share with you a few slides as inputs for discussion for today, as well as for our preparation for the final forum. Please move on to the next slide. Next slide basically shows the Asia's phenomenal economic growth in Asia and Pacific region led to a sharp rising share of the region in global GDP, as you can see from the left and middle chart. And rapid growth also led to a dramatic improvements in Asia broad development indicators. The rate of extreme poverty declined from 60% in year 1980 to down to 7% in year 2015, as you can see from the right chart. And this also accompanied more than 1 billion people escaping extreme poverty. Also, a life expectancy at the birth increased, infant mortality rate dramatically dropped, and the mean years of schooling increased substantially. So these are the phenomenal growth. But next slide, summarizing Asia's development gaps. Next slide, please. Gaps with the development countries still remain large. And now region is facing enormous challenges due to COVID-19. Asian economy should maintain sound policies that prove to be worked and address maintaining and emerging challenges such as the 7 issues listed here. So among the 7 challenges I listed here, I would like to confine our attention to number 6, building back greener and with more resilience. How to achieve a building back greener, protecting the environment and tackling climate change, and also building up more resilience. So next slide, let me start mentioning that while Asia has achieved phenomenal economic growth, it has been relatively dirty. Much of Asia's economic growth has been fueled by increasing reliance on coal, oil, gas-based energy for an expanding array of uses. Also, developing Asia's greenhouse gas emissions have increased rapidly with economic growth. Its global share rose from 23% in year 1990 to 44% in year 2014. Environmental policy responses were initiated and expanded in last 2 or 3 decades, but much more action is needed, obviously, in order to make regions' development sustainable and contribute to global efforts. And next slide, I'd like to mention another very big challenge, which is the Asia's particularly successful to disaster risk. More than 4 in 5 people, 84%, affected by natural hazards live in developing Asia, as we can see from right chart. Extreme weather events, especially floods, but also storms and droughts, or in short, the extreme hydrometeorological events accounted for nearly all people affected in the region, as we can see from the left chart in blue. Disasters happen across the entire region. The map on the right shows the location and death tolls of the most catastrophic events since year 1990, and now COVID-19 pandemic affecting almost everyone in the region and also outside the region. So next slide highlights the importance of building up a resilience. A disaster occurs when a hazard interact with the exposed and vulnerable population. Direct and indirect effects can persist across time, and also impacts can also transmit to other locations with a serious spillover effects across space. There are three key elements to strengthening disaster resilience to tackle this issue and disaster. First, to mainstreaming disaster risk reduction, DRR. Secondly, we should take a risk layered approach to disaster risk financing aspects. And the third one is the concept of building back better, or now building back greener becomes essential once disaster strikes. And next slide, let me turn to the economic cost dimension of climate resilience. Cost of inaction will be very, very high. Estimates by ADB show if the world doesn't deviate from the present trend in greenhouse gas emission, the total cost of climate change could be as high as 12.7% of annual GDP equivalent by year 2100 for the Pacific region, up to 11% for Southeast Asia region, and 8.8% for South Asia region. So cost of inaction will be very, very high. Current pandemic has further highlighted the need for investing in resilience. A pandemic has exposed the underlying drivers of vulnerability, including poverty, limited coverage of social safety net programs, weak health systems, social exclusion, and structural gender inequality, among others. These drivers also contribute to increasing climate risk. The future, we will see more of the compounded risk, not only pandemic, but also other type of disasters. Annual cost of adaptations are very large. UNEP's Climate Change Adaptation Finance Gap Report, year 2016 report, estimates annual cost of adaptation will be between 140 to 300 billion by year 2030, which suggests public budget will not be able to address the financing challenges alone. So next slide, I show the evidence which suggests the investing in resilience generates a wider benefits. Studies show investing in climate adaptation benefits the economy by increasing the resilience of capital stock, keeping public debt dynamics manageable, and maintaining adequate fiscal space in order to cope with extreme weather events and other disasters. Recent estimates show that investing 1.8 trillion globally in 5 climate adaptation areas. Number one, early warning systems. Second, resilient infrastructure. Third, dryland agriculture, crop production. Four, protecting mangroves. And finally, resilient water resources management. From year 2020 to year 2030 could generate 7.1 trillion US dollars in total new benefits. So this is an enormous benefit. The 2019 Carbon Disclosure Project reports that 225 of the world's 500 biggest companies believe climate change could generate over 2.1 trillion US dollars in new business prospects through opportunities in resilient buildings, green infrastructure, coastal infrastructure, etc., etc. And final slide summarizes investment in resilience, needing to promote business not as usual in 4 aspects. Number one, overcoming tragedy of horizon This is very important. Planning needs to consider long-term climate risk consideration and chart out pathways that ensure short-term investments do not lock in economies to maladaptive pathways. Secondly, single sector solution may no longer work. Resilience building needs to consider system-wide interventions and the nexus between food, water, energy, health, trade, etc. Number three, building resilience has to be at the core of infrastructure investment. Infrastructure will have to play a critical role in delivering services that are critical for economic development. This is emphasized in G20 Principle for Quality of Infrastructure Investment, which aims at maximizing the positive economic, environmental, social, and development impact of infrastructure and creating a virtuous cycle of economic activities which ensure sound public finance. Number four, but not least, need to strengthen financial preparedness to deal with disasters. Extreme weather events will continue to increase with climate change. Therefore, financial preparedness needs to be strengthened to ensure that sufficient financing is available to support timely relief, early recovery, and reconstruction efforts. Government can draw on array of disaster risk financing instruments in order to support enhanced financial preparedness, including annual contingency, budget allocation, disaster reserve, contingent credit arrangement, and insurance products. So next slide, just showing a link to our Asian Development Outlook published last year, which has a theme chapter on disaster resilience. I'm looking forward to having a lively discussion. I stop here. Thank you very much. Over to you, Preeti.
Thank you, Savada-san, and thank you for making the point that investment in resilience leads to that triple dividend that you talked about. And this is the time to move beyond business as usual and look at our constructs for economic development in a different way, starting with risks as an initial point and responding to those risks, and also the various aspects you highlighted on taking a systems approach, on building also financial resilience. So this has really started us well on this, and we look forward to your participation in the rest of the event as well. Thank you. Let me now move on to the next presentation by my colleague Orgo Sinha Roy. Orgo is a senior climate change adaptation specialist at the Asian Development Bank, and he is also coordinating this particular stream on economic resilience for the next APAN. So he has done a lot of thinking on what should go into this particular stream, and he'll be making a presentation on that. Over to you, Orgo.
Thank you, Preeti, and a very good afternoon to everybody. So as Preeti mentioned, the APAN forum will have 4 streams, and one of the stream will be on economic sector resilience. So the purpose of this presentation is to introduce some initial thoughts and ideas on what the economic sector resilience stream could potentially focus on. Now, these ideas are based on a recent development, but also gaps in the region, some of which was highlighted by Savada-san. Looking at some of the recent global commitments to scale up actions in resilience, looking at some of the initiatives undertaken by private sector and financial institutions in the last couple of years, which are very exciting, but also recognizing the current situation where the top priority for most countries is on COVID-19 recovery. Next slide. So based on this, the main focus, what we are proposing is that at the forum, the discussion on economic sector tries to make a shift in the narrative from risk to opportunities. So how investing in climate adaptation and resilience can bring opportunities, as highlighted by Savada-san, looking at the triple dividends, the positive economic returns, and the new benefits but also demonstrating how increased investments in adaptation and resilience can increase the attractiveness of private sector investments and provide new business prospects for the private sector. Framing from an opportunity point of view provides an important link to the other streams of the forum, which is inclusive resilience, nature-based solution, and local resilience. Next slide. However, making the shift in framing requires us to highlight that while we need to do more, we also need to do things differently. And as mentioned by Sawada-san, the key is to move away from business as usual development, treating climate risk and opportunities as a starting point for formulating economic policies, plans, and investments. And we are seeing that already happening in many countries in the Pacific Island, for example. Reimagining what economic development should be beyond economic parameters and linking it to social and environmental development and connecting it to concepts of circular economy. And last but not least, the importance of addressing systemic barriers in our society and development, which is important to make any transformational change happen. Next slide. So in this context, it is proposed that the APAN Forum stream could potentially look at 4 interconnected topics. And the next few slides, I'll discuss some of the issues and approaches in these topics, the opportunities and ideas on potentially what the forum could focus on. Next slide. The first topic is looking at longer term planning and fiscal management. Sawada-san did highlight that investments in adaptation and resilience can make capital stock more robust and resilient, public debt more manageable, and create the right fiscal space required to respond to extreme weather events, which unfortunately will increase with climate change. However, this requires factoring resilience considerations and long-term planning issues. So countries' 2040, 2050 visions have to factor resilience. The medium-term plans have to look into resilience more seriously. And the fiscal planning tools, budgetary tools, procurement processes have to factor in climate and disaster risk considerations. Equally important to strengthen the capacity of governments at all levels to take decisions in the context of uncertainty, as also highlighted by Secretary of Department of Finance in his opening speech. There are many opportunities. We have seen the global call by Global Commission on Adaptation last year, where they talk about the importance of connecting resilience to planning and investment processes. The Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action have adopted the Helsinki Principles, which talks about exactly this direction of ensuring public financial management processes look into climate considerations. Thus, potentially the APAN Forum could have dedicated discussions with ministries of planning and finance to understand their needs, the bottlenecks they face, and how this issue can be forwarded. Next slide. The second topic could be on economic sectors, so agriculture, fisheries, tourism, small and medium enterprises. All these are critical, but each of these sectors require to draw the long-term resilient pathways to understand the thresholds and tipping points for various climate variables and how it will impact the supply chain. However, we need to recognize that each of the sectors don't work in isolation. They are heavily interconnected. Thus, for example, solutions to build resilience in the agriculture and the food system will require solutions not only in agriculture sector, but equally solutions in trade, health, social protection, and other sectors. Tourism requires special attention, specifically for small island developing states, and to encourage and incentivize the private sector to invest in adaptation. So is the big missing middle of small and medium enterprises to build their resilience across the supply chain, and especially of micro enterprises where women play an important role. Last but not the least, the important role of technical and vocational training is absolutely critical to influence a labor market required for new types of skills to respond to resilience economic development. The planned update of the nationally determined contributions which countries will undertake, and also the COVID-19 recovery plan, provide huge opportunities to push in this direction. So the suggestion is in the APAN Forum to have dedicated discussions and potentially sessions around these issues, specifically around tourism, but also about vocational training and how to engage TVET organizations in different countries. Next slide. The third issue is looking at infrastructure systems. And the big change is moving beyond making individual infrastructure asset resilient, which is important, but looking at the wider infrastructure systems and the services they provide to the communities and the larger economy. Such a systemic change also enables us to look at solutions beyond hard infrastructure, promoting nature-based solutions, but also promoting behavioral change within the users, which is absolutely critical to manage scarce resources such as water and indirectly reduce stress on infrastructure. Certain infrastructure is critical for economic development, but also highly vulnerable, such as ports in small and island developing countries, and needs special attention. A big spotlight on resilient urban system that recognizes the informal sector and the contribution in the informal sector to the urban economy and how that can be made resilient. The G20 Quality Infrastructure Principles provides us good direction to move forward, and so does the recent development of a coalition for disaster resilient infrastructure spearheaded by Government of India. APAN Forum could specifically look at some of these issues, especially in the context of urban food systems and critical infrastructure such as ports. Next slide. And the fourth and the last topic we proposed is how to strengthen financial systems and financial products for scaling up adaptation. We all know large sum of money is required for adaptation investments. The public sector and the global climate funds can be an important source to unlock future private sector investments. At the same time, new financial products are needed, and products that deliver multiple benefits, especially in the current context of COVID recovery, as well as advancing resilience. Recent years have seen conversation within the private sector and the financial institutions being gearing up and engaging in the discussion of managing physical climate risk. And so does the importance of scaling up financial preparedness measures in countries to deal with extreme events through disaster risk financing solutions. Opportunity lies in the work initiated by the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which aims to encourage investors to demand transparent physical climate risk information and take those decisions for long-term strategic planning. Thus, the APAN Forum could have dedicated sessions and discussions with financial institutions and looking at innovative financial products. These are some of the initial ideas on topics that an APAN Forum could look into, and I'm sure the panelists will talk further on this, and we look forward to your contributions from the participants of today's seminar, which will really help us better frame and curate the actual session in March. Thank you, Preeti.
Thank you, Orgo, and thank you for outlining your initial thinking of four streams that could be addressed in the APAN Forum. The four are related to planning and fiscal management, the role of economic sectors, and of course, infrastructure resilience, and finally, financial systems and financial products. This is time again to engage the audience and launch our next set of 2 questions to seek your views and ideas. So may I request the technical team to start the poll again? So in the context of economic sectors, you're showing your preference on which of the sectors need more climate resilient actions. Agriculture, of course, figures highly considering the dependence of the region on this particular sector, or dependence of large proportions of the population on agriculture for their livelihoods. The next is the small and medium enterprises. And again, their vulnerability came to the fore in the context of the current pandemic that we are in. The industrial sector, tourism, which is very important for certain economies in the region, along with fisheries. So this gives us a sense of the sectors where you think we should be focusing on in terms of building resilience. Let's go on to the next question, please. So what are the key approaches that should underpin our efforts on climate resilience for sustainable economic development? You have to enter phrases over here, whatever comes to your mind as key entry points, key approaches to enhance resilience for sustainable economic development. We see a number of ideas coming up. Of course, the economic aspects, the economic approaches are important. Systemic changes you have picked on. The idea of localization, the importance of indigenous knowledge, absolutely very, very important. Systems thinking is also coming up. Participatory approach, integrating climate resilience in economic policies. I like that clarity of goals and objectives, and the goals and objectives that we set up, not only in the short and medium term, but the long term, I think is an important way forward, as are the financial stimulus packages, providing livelihood opportunities to the vulnerable sectors, behavioral change, absolutely. Fantastic. Behavioral change and the knowledge of the elders. I saw that streaming past as well. Green bonds. Yes, the importance of landscape, the importance of nature-based approaches, which is an important theme also in the overall APAN 7 streams. Information and data gap. Excellent, excellent. I think we've got a very, very good sense of where you're coming from in terms of the variety and the myriad, ways that we need to work to build this economic resilience. And with this, let me now launch into our panel discussion. And I would like to invite our panelists, and I'll introduce them, and I'll request them to switch on their videos as well. Our first panelist is Miriam Anna Hassan from the Ministry of Environment, Maldives. She prefers to be called Anna, and that's how I will refer to her. The next panelist is Mr. Takahashi Kazuaki from the Ministry of Environment, Japan. Welcome, Takahashi-san. The third panelist is Kisa Falila from the International Fund for Agriculture and Development. A very warm welcome to you, Kisa. We also have Amit Prothi from the Global Cities Resilience Network. Hello, Amit, and welcome to this event. And last but not the least, Claire Shakya from the International Institute of Environment and Development. So we have 5 panelists with us, and I'll pose a question each to each of the panelists, and you'll see hopefully from their responses that some of the ideas that you put in the poll for the last question will be elaborated further and amplified as well. So let me start first with Anna from Maldives. Anna, Maldives is a small island developing country and very, very vulnerable to climate change. Your government has identified adaptation as an opportunity, not as a cost, but as an opportunity. And that is a very interesting take that the government of Maldives has taken for its future vision on a resilient Maldives. So could you share some efforts that your government has undertaken in economic sectors, especially tourism and fisheries? As you saw, that also figured in our emphasis, which the audience has provided on what sectors should be looked at. And so what is your government doing in these two sectors or any other sectors to advance climate action? Over to you, Anna.
Well, thank you very much, Preeti. Well, yes, as you have rightfully highlighted, the Maldives is in fact one of the most vulnerable countries to the adverse impacts of climate change. And this is both due to environmental and socioeconomic factors, for example, the low-lying nature and the dispersed nature of islands. And from an economic perspective as well, we are highly vulnerable, mainly due to the low diversified economy, the limited availability of natural resources, and especially our high dependence on imports and the narrow range of exports. So that sort of sets the context as and gives an idea of how vulnerable we are in terms of environmental and from an economic perspective. And as we speak of risks and environmental vulnerabilities, I just wanted to quickly highlight a collaboration we had with ADB recently, which was actually a risk mapping exercise, which we believe would be really helpful in the future to better assess our risks and also, make evidence-based policy decisions in the future. So I just wanted to note that and be really thankful for such a collaboration. Well, then moving on to the tourism and the fisheries sector. Well, yes, our economy is almost entirely dependent on these two sectors, and any sort of external shocks would really have a huge impact on our economy due to our dependency on these two sectors. And this was actually very well portrayed in the current COVID-19 pandemic. Just to give you a perspective on this, I just wanted to highlight a recent study which was done by ADB actually, which showed that the Maldives is amongst the top 3 countries in the region hit hardest by the crisis in terms of its impact on the GDP. And just to give you some numbers here, the predicted GDP for 2020 for our country was actually 7.5% before the outbreak. However, the government forecasts as of 31st of March 2020 alone showed that the real GDP for 2020 is now expected to register between minus 7.8 to minus 11.5%, which actually accounts for a loss of between, let's say, 770 million USD to 904 million USD in state revenue this year alone due to the closure of borders and the subsequent impact it had on the tourism sector. So this sort of gives you an idea of how vulnerable we are in terms of both economic and environmental causes. So now moving on to the real question. So what are we actually doing to address these vulnerabilities? So as a nation, we do have a number of policy tools and plans to integrate climate change adaptation and resilience into our all sectoral policies. We are in fact currently working on a Climate Change Act, which aims to strengthen our existing legal frameworks, which would in the future help us to better mainstream adaptation into all these sectoral policies, which would obviously include the fisheries and the tourism sector. Additionally, our NDC also do highlight these two sectors as two key adaptation sectors, and we have a number of actions as part of the NDC as well that we're hoping to implement. Now, just to sort of highlight some specific examples of initiatives. Firstly, going to the fisheries sector. Our policies encourages sustainable fishing practices to obviously control overexploitation of species, especially things such as live bait sustainability, and also an emphasis on integrated reef fishery management to address the increased demand for reef fishes and the development of overseas markets and the expansion of the tourism sector as well. We also have a number of marine protected areas and protection of species, such as, for example, the parrotfish. And I just wanted to highlight here one really one initiative, the Maldives Biosphere Reserve Initiative, which where the UNESCO declared one of our atolls as a biosphere reserve in 2011, actually. And this was developed primarily to address the biodiversity loss as an alternative to the conventional approaches to conserve the natural environment. And as part of this, reserve, we actually have a fund established as part of the initiative to regulate the biosphere reserve and to promote sustainable livelihoods, conservation, and research in the atoll. And I would say this has been a really successful initiative for us, and the government is actually hoping to replicate this to the rest of the country, and hopefully in the future have a network of such reserves. And actually, just yesterday, 2 additional atolls have been declared as biosphere reserves by UNESCO. So that's one thing that I wanted to highlight here. And also, we are also implementing some community resilience programs with help from ADB under the Preparing Outer Islands for Sustainable Energy Development Project. To name such activities, we are implementing a renewable energy-based ice-making technology for the outer island communities to support fisheries, and also there's a pilot program for RE-based ferry system in the country through ADB support. So those are the things that I wanted to highlight in terms of the fisheries sector. Now, I'll quickly move to the tourism sector. So all of our tourism policies and standards do ensure that climate change adaptation is integrated and aligned into resort development in all the service sectors. And these policies mainly focus on ensuring the sustainability of tourism infrastructure. Additionally, the policies also do encourage community-based adaptation projects in tourism-associated communities. So this sort of gives both the tourism operators and the tourism-dependent communities to work together and address their common vulnerabilities. And this is, I think, a really successful way to tackle these common vulnerabilities. There's also climate proofing of infrastructure in many of the resorts, especially the new investments, and a bunch of RA technologies, a lot of private sector investments in these resorts as well. And just finally, one key thing that I just wanted to touch on is the Maldives Green Tax and the Maldives Green Fund. This green text is actually taken from all tourists who stay in resorts, hotels, and the tourist vessels. And just recently, the government has established a trust fund by the name Maldives Green Fund, which is set up to manage the revenue sourced through the green tax, which would be allocated towards environmental protection and climate change actions. We're still working on how we will allocate the funds towards adaptation, mitigation, and other environmental sectors, but that's something we have in place at the moment. So yeah, we have really ambitious targets and policy tools in place, but really it's given our context and the increase in the extreme weather events and as such, it really is not enough for us. I mean, we are, as you can see, we are a really vulnerable country, and we really need further technical as well as financial assistance to tackle these vulnerabilities. And I am positive that hopefully with support from our development partners, we would be able to tackle these vulnerabilities and, you know, recover well from the current COVID-19 crisis that we are in as well, and grow stronger hopefully in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. You really started us on an optimistic note that about highlighting so many initiatives from the Maldives, you know, be it from the renewable energy sector, be it related to fisheries and tourism, or be it related to infrastructure. And your emphasis on community resilience, you know, all through, and involving the communities also comes through very, very clearly. So thank you for starting us off on what is possible, the art of the possible. Let me move on to our next panelist, which is Kazuaki-san from the Ministry of Environment, Japan. Kazuaki-san, government of Japan has announced its efforts on resilient COVID-19 recovery. And the pandemic has demonstrated also the importance of looking at sustainability and resilience together in a conjoined manner. So how is Japan promoting this linkage and also bringing climate change, adaptation, and circular economy together to ensure socially, economically, and environmentally sustainable future? Over to you, Kazuaki-san, and I understand you have a couple of slides as well, so I'll request the team to put the slides on. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Preeti, and good afternoon and good morning, everyone. I am Takahashi, Director of Climate Change Adaptation Office, Ministry of Environment, Japan. First of all, I'd like to express my great appreciation to Asian Development Bank and Japan Secretariat for organizing and inviting me at this webinar. Regarding the question, in order to ensure the social, economical, and environmental sustainable future, we can think now as an opportunity and the recovery phase from COVID-19 when a kind of paradigm shift is necessary. I'd like to introduce Japan's activities on adaptation with synergy with regional local ecological sphere and synergy between climate change and disaster risk reduction. Impact of climate is dependent on local aspects and will need to deal skillfully with them by adopting adequate measures. In realizing this, Japan's concept, regional, local, circular, and ecological sphere contribute to offer a solution, which aims to be solutions for multiple tasks, including disaster risk reduction. Next slide, please. Thank you. This is an example of the local, circular, and ecological sphere in the north part of Japan in Hokkaido. It is a very small town and surrounded by mountains. But as you see, it tries circulation of energy with biomass, which would reduce CO2 emission and develop forest industry. Besides, this aims to support elderly and disabled persons. This centralized energy can be recovered soon under disaster situation, which can be sought as adaptive measures against climate change effect. Next slide, please. In the context of recovery from COVID-19 pandemic, redesigning our socio-economic system for a more sustainable and resilient world is essential. Our task is not to return to the pre-pandemic world, but to build back better, as mentioned by Sawada-san. Under this concept, Ministry of Environment Japan launched online platform for Design 2020 and for the ministerial online meeting with UNFCCC last month. In the meeting, importance of 3 transitions was discussed: future to a decarbonized society, to a circular economy, and to a decentralized society. This week, only 3 days ago, our Prime Minister Suga stated that Japan will aim to realize a decarbonized society by reducing greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050. We also seek synergies with activities to net zero and other purposes. Next slide, please. In order to realize adaptive societies, we have established regional platform AP-PLAT last year and now cooperate with Asian Development Bank and partner organizations and countries in the region. We'd like to enhance its function to support local regional actions for future climate risk. For realizing circular economy, involvement of public sector is crucial. Ministry of the Environment Japan in cooperation with Japan Secretariat, will open a call for adaptation technology for exhibition at virtual marketplace during 7th APAN Forum in March. By seeking synergies, we would like to achieve goals of SDGs, Paris Agreement, and Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. We would like to collaborate with all of you. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you, Kazuaki-san. And your Prime Minister Suga's announcement last week has really generated a lot of interest and also is probably going to spur other countries in the region to make similar announcements and similar commitments to net zero by 2050. So congratulations on that leadership, and also for highlighting the three transitions that the government of Japan is focusing on: decarbonized society, a circular economy, and a decentralized society. So those are very, very important concepts which are coming to the fore from your presentation. So thank you very much. Let me now move on to our next speaker. This is Kisa from the International Fund for Agriculture and Development. And IFAD has been quite involved, or is at the forefront on the agriculture sector and various initiatives in the agriculture sector, also on strengthening resilience. And the importance of agriculture sector in the context of resilience is undeniable, if I may say so. Given what we have learned from the COVID-19, Kisa, where do you think the opportunities are, or what are the difficulties in making our food systems resilient? So looking at it from a systems perspective, over to you.
Thank you very much, Priya, and thank you for all the participants who have joined the discussions. The International Fund for Agriculture Development works directly with rural smallholder farmers whose livelihoods are directly dependent on agriculture productivity. And therefore, as an institution with this very specific and unique mandate, we have this understanding of the systemic importance of agriculture to the region in terms of its economy, and the critical role that the sector play in development, economic growth, especially in contributing significantly to the GDP, creating employment, and also serving as a key driver for trade in the continent. Therefore, agriculture is at the center of IFAD's business. However, on the other hand, we have an understanding that this sector is extremely vulnerable to different shocks, particularly climate hazards, which are weather related. The sector in itself is very fragmented with having so many players interacting in that particular space. And now these challenges are compounded by the COVID-19 pandemic. How IFAD has responded to the impacts of COVID-19 is inspired by it is driven by our mandate. One is, the first aspect is financial aspect. We always ask ourselves, how do we develop sustainable financial solutions that will directly target smallholder farmers, while at the same time, they will address the impacts of climate change and ultimately achieve the goal of strengthening or building climate resilience. So over a long period of time, IFAD's approach has been to embed climate resilience in the design of its investment. A very good example is the flagship fund, which IFAD is very proud of, called the Adaptation for Smallholder Agriculture Program, or in a short form, ASAP. This fund was developed to channel climate finance directly to smallholder farmers. And the fund is embedded into IFAD's regular investment processes and benefits from rigorous climate analysis and data at that very micro level where the smallholder farmers are operating. The fund was designed in the understanding that smallholder farmers are on the front line of climate change. They inhabit some of the most vulnerable landscapes, such as hillsides in the Bhutan and the Nepal, semi-arid and arid lands. We have the deltas and floodplains in Vietnam and the Cambodia, and the reliance on climate-sensitive natural resources for their livelihood. As a result, these farmers who are on the front line, they are at significant risk from increasing temperatures, erratic rainfall, rising sea levels, and extreme events, such as floods and droughts, landslides, typhoons, and sometimes heat waves. But on the other hand, we are seeing that these smallholder farmers often lack secure land tenure and resource rights and access to markets and finance. They are often overlooked in global and national policy debates on climate change issues, despite the fact that these poor rural communities endure the most of the impact of climate change and are key to the solution. And therefore, a very good example of the usefulness of this fund has been on a project in Bangladesh, in the northwestern part of the country, the Haor region, which is perhaps the most vulnerable area of Bangladesh. And also we are seeing very high levels of poverty. And it normally experiences flash floods, which sometimes wash away their main crop, which is normally the rice. So what this particular fund did was to design a flash flood warning system that alerts the farmers 2 or 1 month before the harvest period to allow the farmers to give them sufficient time to harvest their crop before the onset of the flash flood. It was tested this year in the peak of the pandemic. And that is when we learned how resilient this fund has been, because the farmers were able to harvest their before the onset of the flash flood and during the time of a peak pandemic as a result of the COVID-19. So we drew inspiration from that to design what we call now the Rural Poor Stimulus Facility, to be able to be very unique, particularly responding to the impacts of COVID-19, while at the same time building resilience of rural livelihoods. So this facility, which was set up this year, it seeks to improve the resilience of rural livelihoods in the context of COVID-19 crisis by ensuring that there is timely access to inputs to smallholder farmers. They have information at the right time and the right information to be able to make informed decisions. They have access to markets, and at the same time, there is liquidity within the system. So the planned interventions under this facility fall into 4 main categories. One is providing inputs and basic assets for production of crops, livestock, and fisheries. Secondly is to facilitate access to markets to support small-scale farmers in selling their products in conditions where market functions are very restricted. Thirdly, it is targeting funds for rural financial services to ensure sufficient liquidity and to ease repayment requirements so as to maintain services, markets, as well as job creation. And fourthly, it is promoting the use of digital services to deliver key information on production, weather, finance, and markets. A very good example of the use of this facility is a project in Cambodia, where immediately IFAD was required to repurpose its projects to be able to utilize this facility by either designing new investments within the existing project, but responding to the impacts that the smallholder farmers are facing as a result of COVID-19. So the project in Cambodia was restructured to provide immediate production support to these vulnerable smallholder farmers by receiving extension training and input support to increase their productivity, especially for short cycle products such as poultry and vegetables, which are also strengthening that whole food systems in terms of integrating nutrition aspects of these smallholder farmers. And it also tried to design mobile vegetable markets to comply with all the relevant hygiene and safety precautions. And it has also been able to set up at the provincial level to promote local production and sales, and also bringing together collectors and aggregators and buyers to be able to connect directly with these small-scale producers groups in service of reestablishing the local value chains. And the time frame for disbursing these investments under these facilities is 18 months to stay true to the objective of responding to an emergency. And also in Sri Lanka, what we are seeing is that the facility has responded.
May I ask you to wind up, because I'm keeping a watch on the clock and we have two more speakers and lots of questions coming through. So if you could wind up in the next 2 minutes, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So the second aspect that we are trying to really promote is innovation, especially the role of digital agricultural platforms. The importance of technology in building resilience of food systems is critical in this aspect, and technology has been playing a pivotal role in agriculture sector in enhancing productivity, communication, and access to markets. However, this platform existed before COVID-19, but what we have seen after COVID-19 has certainly accelerated digital adoption across most sectors. And adoption of these technology platforms, as well as the use of smart farming concepts, for example, the use of drones to monitor the health of crops, and also to regulate soil moisture directly corresponding to farmer needs. And lastly, what IFAD is doing is the role that partnerships can play given how fragmented the sector is. And another example is in Bangladesh, where we are working directly with organizations like PKSF, which has quite a lot of preferred small and medium enterprises. So they are on lending and managing the funds on our behalf. So to conclude, the three aspects can anchor as building blocks or pathways that are critical in enhancing climate resilience of smallholder farmers as we move forward. Over.
Thank you, and apologies for interrupting you, because you were making a fantastic survey of all that IFAD is doing, focusing on small land holders and focusing on nutrition as well. That I think is an important point you made, apart from the new facilities that you have set up, which is taking a very comprehensive view of inputs, access to markets, rural finance, rural services, as well as the importance of digital services, data and information, and innovation. So thank you for your intervention and for the live examples that you brought to the table. Let me now move on to our next speaker, which is Amit from Global Resilient Cities Network. Amit, from your work in this network, how are you changing the narrative on opportunities that urban systems provide to strengthen resilience? So over to you, and I believe you have some slides as well.
Yeah, thank you, Preeti, and thank you to the ADB for inviting me. So I think it's important first to focus on why cities. I think we've talked a lot about risk in Asia Pacific. Cities bear a lot of this risk. So, there is an estimated 410 million people in Asia living with risks of coastal flooding by 2025. Disasters are costing cities more than $314 billion in damage every year. And the opportunity, frankly, to move towards more innovation, more creativity actually may also be in cities, because about 60% of the area that's projected to be urban by 2050 has not been built yet. So I'm just highlighting some key points. I think all of the urban experts here know this. There's a reason we all focus on cities. I represent a network called Global Resilient Cities Network that was set up by the Rockefeller Foundation in 2013 with the intention of really elevating the discourse and the narrative and the understanding of resilience at the urban sector systems, urban systems level, and this is a global network of cities. So you see on the right, we have cities that are in the global north, in the global south, emerging markets, etc. So part of the reason we are a network that is global is also to be able to understand what are different cities doing in the space of urban resilience, and how can that how can we bring lessons across to other cities. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I think one of the first things to recognize is that at the urban level, there is not a whole lot of good understanding of risk. And the reason I say that is, if you don't understand risks, how are you going to come up with, the opportunities that the interventions that we're going to put in may provide? So one of the things that we've spent a lot of time doing is working with cities in the network to try to understand not only the stresses that they're undergoing today, but how do those stresses become challenges for the future? And then how do you actually innovate to address those challenges? The image in the middle on the top is an example. The New York Times did an example in Houston after there was a major flood in 2017, where they found that in 1992, there was an area that was flooded. Everybody knew it was flooded. And yet the city policies allowed development to happen in that area. And hence in 2016 and 2017, when there was a major storm, this area flooded and there was a lot of damage. So the city didn't really understand that risk, and the city didn't use that understanding of risk in their policies. So what we have tried to do is work with our cities to understand risk. And the example on the top right is a study we did with CSIRO out of Australia, a partner we worked with, where we looked at a couple of districts in Da Nang in Vietnam, which is very prone to coastal storms and coastal flooding, and did an assessment of the housing to understand, what is the risk to the houses when the wind speed changes, what is the damage that could happen, and hence what should be the potential interventions that could be targeted so that you're using your resources more carefully and more efficiently. So again, understanding risk has something that we recognize is incredibly important. The other point I want to make is also we need to be able to communicate risk. It's all well and good if us, experts in the room understand what the risk is, but the decision makers don't understand that risk. And it's not just the decision makers, but also the audience at large needs to understand what is the risk. So what we have also done is with our global network of 100 cities, we've actually helped around 83 cities now have a resilience strategy. This is all publicly available online, where they've documented what are the challenges, resilience challenges that they're facing in an effort to actually communicate that to a wide group of stakeholders. So the image on the bottom right is from the resilience strategy in Wellington, which is just communicating what are the risks that city faces in the long term. So again, I think understanding and communicating risk is something that's incredibly important if we need to innovate in this space. Next slide. So how do you really start to change the narrative from risk to opportunity? So once you understood the risk, I think the opportunity really what we are finding lies in starting to share examples. There are cities in the world who are innovating in this space. And what we are trying to do is bring those examples to other cities. So for example, the bottom left is an image of the Marina Barrage in Singapore, which is a multi-purpose infrastructure, addressing flood risk, addressing water supply, and it's creating a space that's a livable space for the community. So this kind of multiple benefits approach, which is really needed if we need to shift the, business, we need to move away from business as usual. These examples do exist. They may not be all over the place, but they do exist. And the idea that for us really is, how do we bring those examples to other cities in our network? So similarly, the middle column there has an example from Rotterdam. Rotterdam is one of the leaders when it comes to water management. They've looked at flood management quite carefully. They've designed physical spaces across their city that are livable places that also function from a flood mitigation or flood management point of view. Now, we've actually been able to build a partnership between Rotterdam and Surat in India. Surat is one of the fastest growing cities globally, fastest urbanizing cities globally, and faces a water management challenge. What we've tried to do, and the image at the bottom, in that bottom column, is engineers from Rotterdam working with engineers in Surat, trying to understand how does Surat design their water systems better. And that partnership has taken more than a year to actually put into. So it's about capacity building, but it's long-term relationship building. It's long-term sharing of examples. It's long-term, getting the different cities to understand how they need to move the needle on moving away from business as usual. So we've spent a lot of time on building capacities through our network, and we'll continue to do that. The other thing I wanted to highlight, the image on the top right, which is the D3. So the city of Quito went through a resilience strategy process with us, identified that food security was a challenge. They identified that in 2018. They started to think about food security, urban farming, etc. in Quito, starting to address that from an issue of vulnerability, providing nutrition to low-income residents, migrants, providing job security, skills development, etc. They started focusing on this in 2018. What happened? COVID happened. And when COVID happened, this city actually had the ability to feed 100,000 vulnerable people because they had already started to organize their urban farming system. So they had understood the risk during the strategy process and started to address that risk in their system. And when there was COVID, when there is this pandemic, they've been able to show that they are much more resilient than other cities that are not prepared. We're trying to push for a similar kind of initiative in Chennai and several others in the cities in the region, essentially saying, you have to look at understanding systemic stresses, but also then coming up with solutions that provide co-benefits. So urban horticulture provides you the benefit of both livelihood opportunity and food security. Circular economy is another issue we are tackling within this region, which is again combining livelihood opportunities with waste management. So the idea really what I'm trying to highlight here is you need to understand the risk, and city networks such as ours help because we're bringing solutions from one city to another. But beyond that, one needs to say, how do you innovate and look at solutions that provide these co-benefits? And, Sawada-san talked about it, Argo talked about it. It's by bringing these solutions and by thinking from a multiple dimensional perspective and by sharing examples. I mean, I think one of the things we all recognize is practitioners on the ground and city leaders on the ground helped. I mean, it is helpful for them to see real examples. And so we try to do a lot of that, essentially to change again that narrative. You understand the risk, and now this is how you look at that risk as an opportunity to address your multiple challenges across the city. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Amit, and thank you for highlighting the necessity of not only understanding risk and communicating it, and also changing the narrative from risk to opportunities. And the twinning of cities and the emphasis on learning by doing and sharing that experience. I think your network is really leading in that context. And the example of Quito and food security also in the larger context brings those linkages between the rural and the urban and the vulnerability of those systems that has been exposed in the current context. So thank you for your intervention. And I know Claire has been waiting very, very patiently. It's always difficult for the last person on the panel, and I don't want to rush you, Claire, but you're going to talk about an important aspect, which is access to financing, since financing is so critical. And if you could highlight what are the reforms we need in our financial systems to enable this access to finance, and some of the innovative financing mechanisms that could enable it. For example, recently your institution has brought out a think piece on large-scale debt swaps for climate and nature. So that is one example of innovative financing mechanisms. But we'd like to hear from you on how to make the finance flow. Over to you, Claire.
Thank you very much. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. So I guess the starting premise is that the financial architecture isn't working for adaptation and resilience in the poorest countries. We've just heard some amazing examples of where we are improving and we are getting it better, but at the moment it's still not enough. So, and getting this right is vital to support inclusive economies, ensuring societies across the world can thrive in the future. And in many countries, as much as 90% of jobs are in the informal economy. So we really need to think about how we innovate. COVID-19 has also shown how interconnected we are and how interconnected shocks are for communities, whether climate, nature, health, or economic. So currently, too much of development and climate finance fails to reach the most vulnerable countries and communities. Just taking climate finance, the poorest countries, the 47 LDCs, which are about 1 billion people, receive less than $1 in $5 of climate finance. Just $1 in $10 is committed to reach local communities. And even in the largest flow for mitigation, it's under $1 in $10 for decentralized energy. And this year, in fact, 3/4 of that finance for decentralized energy went to just 3 companies. So it's very concentrated. And we need to look at the whole landscape of actors to tackle the challenges of getting money where it matters. So today we see ourselves in a little bit of a catch-22, a negative feedback loop arising from our traditional business as usual approaches. Because poor countries and their communities, small enterprises, don't have the track record to access funds directly, the funding is highly intermediated. And this type of project finance is based on agreed results, meaning delivery is inflexible with a focus on compliance rather than responsiveness to changing context. Projects often focus on solutions dreamt up by distant experts and are too short term to strengthen the capabilities of national institutions that national institutions require to access finance directly. So what we're looking for is change throughout the system. So for developing countries, this requires building the architecture now for resilience. And we're framing this as delivery mechanisms that can provide the plumbing that gets predictable finance down to local economies in ways that enable local innovation at scale, able to respond to diverse local contexts and tackle structural inequality. And this requires things like enabling the governance arrangements to get communities and local governments working together to invest in resilient places and landscapes, building shock responsive social protection systems that enable the most vulnerable households to also grow productive enterprises, and providing climate and business advice alongside loans to small enterprise to help them be more attractive to private investors. These mechanisms need to be flexible, responsive to local priorities as things change, as we've seen this year with COVID, droughts, floods, all happening together for some communities. And with effective transparency to enable learning as well as accountability of leaders and power holders. And these power holders include donors. So for donors, they need to start tackling their challenge of aggregation so they can invest in large enough amounts to handle the transaction costs. And this requires them to take more risk to enable transformation and change the incentives for those who are managing their funds. It requires providing longer term patient funding to enable the learning and adjustment essential to develop those trustworthy delivery mechanisms. That with governance arrangements that allow that flexibility at the local level, and with real transparency from donor to end use to invest in accountability to the citizens of both the donors and the partner countries. And for the intermediaries, the technical advisors, whether the UN, the MDBs or other partners, this requires shifting internal incentives, so success is not in meeting a set of predetermined results, but in supporting partner institutions to develop these delivery mechanisms at real scale. And it's all about working ourselves out of a job by enabling national and local institutions to build their climate capabilities for transparent and accountable use of finance and for agile decision-making that can deal with long-term uncertainty. There are signs of hope. We're producing a good climate finance guide currently that identifies what those in the landscape, all the different actors, see as the most transformational investments by global funds and intermediaries, and demonstrate what's possible and what we can all seek to do more of. And the Climate Resilient Partnership Programme of the ADB is one of these. There's also traction around the locally led action track of the Global Adaptation Commission, where a set of principles to codify what good practice looks like and how to change incentives are getting traction. And moving development partner, the idea of this is to move development partners from business as usual to business unusual. There's also a political moment right now with the run up to the COP26, which has given us more time than we might have had otherwise in setting a long-term climate finance target that also improves access to finance and changes these incentives in the system. So we're investing in the national architecture for resilience, the financial plumbing, and the systems of governance that are fit for the future. We need to define climate finance around its purpose, and the purpose needs to be around transforming systems, using climate finance to innovate, de-risk, and really leverage in the wider financing flows that are needed in development, ODA, in private investment and domestic budgets. But with debt rising rapidly, we also need to find ways to raise the finance needed to really increase the amount of finance available. And with COVID-19 demonstrating just how interconnected our economies are and how quickly countries are getting into debt to protect economies that are not sufficiently resilient to maintain jobs, we're proposing a large-scale climate and nature debt swaps. And the idea is these swaps would be designed as budget support to be of sufficient scale to tackle the debt crisis and to support countries to develop this architecture for climate and ecological as well as economic resilience, moving from small-scale projects that are traditional into debt swaps. The idea would be to effectively reward the developing countries that adjust their core development investments around decentralization, social protection, community and enterprise support, to provide strategic investments into resilience, building that architecture, strengthening their institutions at national and local level to be agile and responsive and able to respond to the climate, health and economic shocks of the future. So we're calling for a technical working group to be set up under the IMF or World Bank guidance to address these triple crises of climate, nature and poverty while tackling unsustainable debt. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire, and sorry to rush you, but there were some very, very important points you made about delivery mechanisms, the plumbing, as you call it, and also the governance arrangements. So absolutely important. And it's not only about, the recipients of finance, the way you highlighted how the providers of finance need to also change their policies, the incentives, the risks, and the long-term nature of the problem requiring, long-term patience funding, and of course, the debt for nature and climate action, modality that you're talking about. So thank you for that. And I truly apologize to the participants that I haven't managed to keep time well. But if you agree, we'll go over a few more minutes. And I also want to assure you that you have an opportunity to continue the discussion online. But if you'd permit me, I'll take only one question of the 20-odd questions that have come through the Q&A box. And if Assistant Secretary Paula Alvarez is still in the meeting, I'd like to ask her to address this question, especially from the work they're doing in the Philippines on what kind of policies can expedite climate resilience while eventually also ensuring economic growth. Paula, if you're there, could you respond to that question? I assume she had another commitment and has probably left the meeting. But would any one of the panelists like to address this question, because it is talking about, the larger question we have on, and all of us think that investing in climate resilience is an opportunity and will kind of also ensure economic growth. Would any of the panelists like to take this as an example? Any policy that comes to your mind?
Well, I can try. I mean, I think the issue is it's not one policy. The issue is that we really need to look at the set of policies that change how the whole economy and societies are responding to different shocks. So there are I mean, if you began to name the policies, there are so many, and it does depend from country to country on how they've structured things. But the sort of getting that long-term thinking into the process and incentivizing that, thinking about the sort of the possibilities of a much longer form of investments, how you structure and incentivize a whole range of distributed actors to start to respond to that sort of the set of uncertainties that we're facing now. So it would be more about what's in the set of policies rather than a single policy, I'd say.
Okay. Could I also request all the panelists to switch on their video, because we are coming to the end of the panel discussion, and I think the organizers want us all to be present and also for me to thank you for an exciting discussion in this panel. We've touched on very many aspects, led by Secretary Dominguez and Savada-san, who set the scene for the panelists, bringing forth various aspects of economic sector resilience. And I will not summarize the discussion, but I also want to let you know that to the wider audience, that there is a possibility of continuing the conversation on this subject through something which is called the Slack workspace. And my colleagues have put the link in the chat box. And this is for networking, discussions with the stream leads, and providing feedback on program agenda, etc. So after the end of the seminar, you can click on this link to continue the discussions leading up to the APAN forum. So it is a space that we have provided. And to those of you, whose questions we could not respond to specifically today, you can take them up in the Slack workspace. I'll just ask the technical team whether we have time to run the last two questions in the poll. If not, please let me know, then I'll make one more announcement. Okay, so this was a question on the type of institutions which should be more involved in the APAN 7 stream on economic sector resilience. And of course, the role of ministries of planning and finance is critical and essential. The financial institutions also play an important role, but more importantly, an aspect which we touched upon in a marginal manner is also the role of the private sector. Of course, Anna talked about it in the context of tourism and Maldives. So yes, the government, the private sector, and financial institutions, all three need to be involved, not only in the discourse, but also in the APAN stream. And can we go on to the last question, please? And again, this is an open-ended question. Which is the stream on economic sector resilience that you would like to see dedicated sessions on? And while you are filling in your responses over here, I would also like to let you know that the next webinar in this series of curtain raisers that we have organized for you is going to be on ecosystems, climate change, and people, strengthening nature to enhance resilience in the Asia Pacific. This will be hosted on 5th of November at 2 p.m. Bangkok time. And the link for this event is also provided in the chat box. And I see various suggestions coming in for the streams on economic sector resilience. And we will take note of all of these while designing the actual forum in March. And we would also encourage you to please continue your conversation with the panelists or with the stream lead, which is my colleague Orgo Sena Roy, on this particular stream through the Slack workspace. This is a new term to me, but I'm glad that we are providing this platform for you to continue to remain engaged with us in the hosting of the APAN forum, which government of Japan has kindly agreed to host in Japan in March 2021. So thank you again to all the esteemed speakers and panelists, and to all of you for remaining engaged in this event. I see that even now we have more than 120 participants in the event, so which is of course a reflection on your interest on the subject, and also your resilience for staying completely engaged through this long event. Thank you, and thank you to the technical team also for the smooth functioning of this event, and to my colleague Orgo Sena Roy for coordinating it. So take care and be safe, and see you in the Slack workspace. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.